and it's a pleasure to be here speaking with you all. I'm hoping that you are coming here with open minds and slightly more energetic excitement even at the end of your day so that we can talk a little bit more about social innovation. And I am more than happy to stop the presentation and talk and answer questions throughout, so do not feel like you have to hold your question to the end. This is meant to be an engaging, interactive session. Please do either raise your hand or put something in the chat if you'd like to ask questions, and otherwise we will jump in. I will share my screen. All right. And everyone should be able to see that. So let us go ahead and start. Social innovation. You may have heard the term before. It is something that is differently defined in every country around the world. And essentially what it means to me is working on something that will have direct societal good benefits and impact. So when we talk about social innovation, it doesn't have to be something that is deep tech. So a lot of times people think of, a cancer drug. But it could also be something as simple as the food that you see on the screen. Anybody know what this fruit is? I'll give you a hint. You can find it in India. You can find it in Indonesia.
Was from India.
Is it passion fruit?
Not passion fruit, although that's a good guess. So this is a bale fruit. B-A-E-L. And bale fruit was used in the University of Hafna in order to create a yogurt. And this yogurt was something that is able to create a new economy for the area. It is using a resource that already existed locally to benefit people by giving them healthier food, by increasing the job opportunities, and by creating new ways for the university to bring in revenue. That is an example of social innovation. Social innovations save lives. They improve communities. They create opportunities. But how do you identify social innovation within your area? So it's important to start from what you know. You want to start at the very local level. What are the challenges within your own community? What are some of the things that you're seeing, that you're dealing with, that your inventors are dealing with? You want to break down the cost, the benefits, the opportunities, and the challenges. You want to make sure that you can articulate the value proposition with what you're addressing. You need to develop a team and set clear end goals. And finally, you'll want to assess the market, the competition, and the funding opportunities. This is an example here of a parking garage that collapsed in Taiwan. And the University of Science and Technology invented the steel beam-to-column connection, which enabled them to rebuild the garage in a better, faster, more efficient fashion that was acclimated to the weather and the unique challenges within that country, rather than trying to fit a technology from somewhere else into a strange environment. So when we talk about social impact, we are talking about the direct social impact of your communities. And when we talk about starting from what you know, I suspect everybody here has seen some kind of a problem within your community. Maybe you have food scarcity. Maybe you have challenges with your roads not necessarily maintaining. Maybe you have challenges with climate impact and the weather has gotten more difficult to deal with. Maybe you have problems with it being too hot or being too cold. Maybe you have problems with the water not being safe to drink. These are all problems that we've experienced in different parts of the United States, and I suspect many other places around the world are having similar challenges. So what can you do to address those? What can your innovators do to address those? Who are some of those partners that might be able to help with the cost of bringing those technologies to the market? And what are some of the value propositions? We can all assume that clean water is a pretty obvious value proposition, but when it comes to actually developing a technology, you need to be able to clearly articulate that value proposition. It's not enough to say, well, everybody needs clean water. You want to be able to specifically enunciate the value of that clear water. So it is important to have clean water because it will reduce the number of people who get sick in our community. If we reduce the number of people who get sick, then we don't have as many people who are out of work, which means that people are able to bring in money, which means that they're able to pay for goods and services and education, right? So clean water is good. Yes, we all know that. But you want to articulate the value of that in a way that makes people want to buy into your vision. When you develop a team, none of us can do it alone. We all need to have support from somebody else. So who is your team? Is your team other people at the university? Is it collaborators within your community? Is it other institutions in your country, in your region? Is it funding partners? And what is a clear goal? Clean water. Sounds great, but what is the actual specific goal? Not having concrete structures that collapse. Sound great, but what is the specific goal? So you want to be able to articulate not just the value proposition, but the end goal. What is the thing you want to see happen? In this case, the National Taiwan University wanted to reduce the collapsing of structures that were occurring when the tsunamis were hitting. And so they were able to build a new technology that was quickly implemented into their existing construction processes that allowed them to have stronger and safer and more efficient construction of parking garages and buildings. Finally, you want to assess that market and competition. So who else has a product out there now? How easy is it for you to get that product? How expensive would that product be? And how do you have a way to pay for that? So when you're thinking about your technology, you're probably not going to create something that is so new, so novel, nobody's ever seen anything like it. You're probably going to do incremental, iterative design on something that already exists because you're looking at optimizing something for your area, for your region. So you want to know what the market and the competition look like. Who else is doing something? How do you distinguish yourself from whatever they are doing? And how do you prove that? We talked a little bit about clean water. I wanted to give you an example from my community. So globally, there are billions of cases of waterborne illnesses annually, with people dying or getting sick, especially within our children. When one of the professors I worked with at Eastern Kentucky University traveled to East Africa with a group of students who were studying public and environmental health, he encouraged them to identify concerns close to home in Kentucky that they could research and solve for. So what does Kentucky have to do with Kenya? Well, it turns out both of them have poor water quality, especially in the rural areas of those communities. And so together, these students and the professor said, well, we know how to measure that the water is unsafe, but it requires a lab. It requires extensive equipment. It requires money. It requires time. It requires training. And none of those things are readily available, especially in the field, especially in these rural communities. And so Dr. Marion invented something that he called ColleGlow. And ColleGlow is a very simple kit that can be used within 24 hours or less to assess the presence of the E. coli within the water. This kit cost less than $10 to create, and this kit is something that can be readily taught to the community to use. You don't need to send a scientist or a doctor out. Anyone in the community can run the kit, get the results, and know the quality of their water. ColleGlow competed in the Unite for Sight Global Health and Innovation Conference and took home first prize. This is a global conference, and it's a small local university within a small rural state in the United States. So one of the things I want you to take away here is the collaboration, right? From Kentucky to Kenya. We're looking together to create solutions. The second thing I want you to take away is you don't have to have a huge university research lab. Eastern Kentucky University is not a wealthy institution. They have a small amount of research, but it is nowhere near Ohio State where I worked. It is nowhere near Stanford or Johns Hopkins or MIT. But because they were thoughtful, because they identified something within their community, because they created those partnerships, they were able to put together a technology that changed their local community and partnered with Kisii University in Kenya to change that local community. You will probably have seen this at some point. If not, this is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, adopted by the United Nations in 2015. When we talk about social innovation, this is often the first place that I send innovators. If you're just not sure where to start, if you need a little bit more inspiration, these 17 development goals are a wonderful place to start because you can find funding related to each of these goals. So I'm going to pause here a moment and either in the chat or feel free to raise your hand and come off of mute. How many of you have addressed one of these goals? You can put the number of the goal you've addressed in the chat, or you can come off and tell us a little bit more about how you have done something with one of these goals.
The chat is disabled, so if the moderator might enable us to send.
I see, Priscilla, you have your hand up, and thank you, Haron.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I apologize. My video is not working, so my sincere apologies for that. Maybe just briefly for me. So I'm from Papua New Guinea, and I'm a co-founder of a not-for-profit organization that's promoting the ICT sector. So basically promoting it as a key enabler for economic and social development. So positioning the sector. I think for me would be goal number 17, so UN SDG 17, Partnership for the Goals. We work within the Triple Helix Innovation Model, which is the government, private sector, and academia. So we work with different partners to address the other 16 UN SDG goals. And we find that very effective because the economic clusters bounces off the Triple Helix Innovation Model, which is working with all these different partners that are specialized in these different areas. And one of the things that we try to look at is create incubation and accelerator spaces that harness and develop, give birth to innovation. And that's where we draw from all these different partners where they can come into that space, particularly for academia as well, especially for the research and development piece. But I'd just like to share that goal number 17 would stand out for us.
That's great. Thank you, Priscilla. I also heard goal number 8, economic growth, goal number 9, industry innovation and infrastructure. These definitely do come together. Haruna?
Yes, thank you. I'm a professor of aquatic ecology together with fisheries resources management as a part of my research. I have worked closely with SDG 14 and also SDG 13 in fisheries and aquaculture. With regard to SDG 14, I have been working and leading a regional research projects on pollution, particularly microplastics pollution in the Ganges Delta and the Bay of Bengal. But also I have supported developing draft policy documents and evaluations, regional evaluations with regard to SDG 14. I have worked with FAO and World Fish Center for evaluation and developing policies regarding SDG 14, more particularly with fisheries blue economy. Regarding climate actions, some of my researches are related to actually climate adaptation in aquaculture. So this is how I have some contributions in these two SDGs. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And also I'm hearing sustainable communities, number 11, and I'm seeing number 6, clean water. Right, does anybody else want to share with us? Salini?
Yeah, hi. I am an IP professional and also a valuation valuation resource person, IP valuation. So I work closely with inventors, and I'm here to talk about goal number 6. I work closely with the Goa Waste Management Corporation in my state, and we are helping them. We're helping them address the sanitation issue and reuse and recycle a lot of waste, especially in C&D when we have demolition zones. So we collect all that rubble, and I've helped them patent a brick that can be made out of that construction debris. And we're also working on sifting through the ocean because we are a coastal state. So working on innovations where we can sift through the garbage that ends up in the ocean and collect it and compress it. And a lot of that is being used to make sculptures around the state right now.
That is wonderful. As someone who is eating the fish off the coast of Goa, I'm glad to hear that you're trying to keep the water clean there. And I'm also seeing number 13, climate action, and number 8, right, economic growth and decent work opportunities. So wonderful, everyone. Thank you for sharing. And let's continue on. So when it comes to doing this type of work, making that alignment with those sustainable development goals can be part of your value proposition. For example, if you are someone who is helping to support the development of a women's textile shop, and they have a web presence so that they can reach outside of the community, you're working on goal number 5, gender equality. You're working on goal number 12, responsible consumption, because you can work with them to recycle, reuse, or resell products. You're working on decent pay and economic growth. The shop is able to pay good wages equitably because they do have that local and that web presence. Or if you're within the agricultural market, you might be focusing on the goal of zero hunger, number 2. And you may be able to develop out an industry, innovation, and infrastructure, number 9. And good health and well-being as the community has safer, better food to eat. So let me give a little story, another example here. I worked with a student who came to Northern Kentucky University from Nepal. And she came from a small rural farming community in the mid part of Nepal, just right below the mountainous regions. And so her focus was on helping her community to retain more of the dollars that they got from their farming communities. So what she was seeing, and she identified as a problem, is that frequently the food that was being created within the community was being bought up by middlemen and shipped down to the big city. And the farming community themselves could not afford their food because it was so much more expensive to work with this middleman. And in order to bring the food back into the local grocery stores, they had to go through this same middleman. So what she did was she developed out a plan to create a co-op in the community. And through that co-op, it was creating an agricultural exchange within one of the buildings in the area, and essentially created a farmer's market of sorts, where people could bring their goods and services and sell them at cost to the community or to the middlemen who would be taking those down to the bigger cities. She also developed a method of presenting the information to some of the farmers that would be further out using WhatsApp in order to communicate with the communities, and also flyers for people who were not as technologically connected. And then she also developed a method of transportation, allowing people to connect with using their carts or using the equipment they already had which would then bring in new wages and new revenue to the community for farmers who weren't able to transport their goods themselves. So when we're talking about this, I was thinking, well, how can I help? So I'm an innovation manager who lives in the United States. What am I going to do to help this person who wants to set up a business in relatively rural Nepal? Well, one of the things that came to mind was helping to give her the tools. Whether or not it was going to be set up in Kentucky or in Nepal, she would need to have the same types of tools to get started. We would still need to talk about copywriting some of the flyers. We would still need to talk about creating a trademark on the business. We would need to talk about setting up the business itself. What kind of business was it going to be? Where was it going to be registered? We needed to talk about how to think about developing the startup's structure. What would be the actual documentation? How would she hire someone? How would she manage them from another country? So even when you're thinking around doing social innovation, the same types of things that you use to develop out deep technologies, science-based technologies, STEM field technologies, is going to be the same for social innovation. You're going to have the same types of questions, you're going to have the same types of needs, you're going to have to do the same type of assessment, and oftentimes the same type of intellectual property will still be engaged. So some of the parameters we want to think about are the fields in which you are working. Social innovation can cross all kinds of fields. We looked at the 17 goals. We heard from some of you on what kinds of technologies you're working on. Social innovation is not just specifically in a non-STEM field. It can absolutely be related to the STEM field. It is not something that is only in the nonprofit space. It can absolutely make money. But what are the fields that you're going to be focusing on is an important question to ask yourself. The next step that you want to talk about is collaborations. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, you can't do this in a vacuum. You're not going to be able to get the support that you need to do this if you don't bring in partners and collaborators from across your community. What is the intent and what are the goals? So a lot of times my innovators come to me and they say something like, I want to help this group of people. I want to make a change in my community. I want to develop a software that allows it to be easier for people to do something, to talk about something, to engage with each other. That's all good and well, but what is the intent and what is the goal as it relates to tech transfer, as it relates to knowledge exchange? That's your role as an invention manager, to think about how to translate this person's good intent into a specific goal that has an end, that has a beginning, and that has a way to actually generate long-term results, long-term funding. You also want to think about it from an educational perspective. So how many of you, either in the chat or by raising your hand, how many of you have worked with someone else in your university to give a guest lecture, to put together a certificate, to put together a program, or some other way to educate the students in your community around doing tech transfer? No one else has worked with students? Vlad, your hand should be raised because you're putting together something right now.
No. But Shalini, you want to say something?
I just raised my hand because I work closely with education is a huge part of what I do in terms of raising awareness about intellectual property, with commercialization and tech transfer being the end goal of it, and not just obtaining a registration certificate. So I worked with WIPO, talking to school students, explaining to them what IP is and what eventually tech transfer would entail. And I also talk a lot to university students in India about tech transfer and valuation and commercialization, of which tech transfer is a huge part.
Absolutely. And WIPO is a great resource. If you don't know what WIPO is, that's the World Innovation Patent office, intellectual property office, and just like each country has their own patent office, WIPO is responsible for supporting intellectual property worldwide. They have a lot of fantastic resources. They put out a lot of information. They put out a lot of collaboration. They have training programs. If you have not yet gotten involved with WIPO, I highly recommend going to their website and looking at more information on them. Anur, do you have another example of how you help to support education?
Primarily, I'm a professor, so I teach my students, but I'm also a member of the Innovation Hub that has been formed around 1.5 years ago in my university. So through this Innovation Hub, a group of teachers and officials are the members. We are working closely with the ICT ministry to enhance innovation amongst the student community. And last year we held a competition, idea competition for the students, which actually I presented the idea of the idea competition before the students, and I was one of the evaluators of this competition submitted by students. And this is how I am as a team working to enhance innovation amongst our students.
Wonderful. Yes, and competitions are a great way to get people involved. In Kentucky, we had a innovation competition where we offered a relatively small amount of funds that really allowed people to come and talk and engage. And so working with your educational hat on is a really important part of intellectual property management. You aren't going to be just sitting in your office looking at inventions that are pouring in the door. You are absolutely going to need to get out, talk to people, engage, have people start moving and getting comfortable with you, getting comfortable with innovation. Priscilla.
Just an example for us from Papua New Guinea, where we ran the first hackathon in academia. It was quite interesting. The students had so many great ideas. They didn't know where they could go to and express those ideas. We had academia, the lecturers in the competition, and they were just quite impressed with the students and how their ideas came out. And I think that created more conversations. The student went on to create a technofest, an annual technofest in the university, and it started creating conversations around IP, how they can protect the ideas. So that's just an example of the interventions we can do with academia as well through hackathons.
Absolutely, yes. I like hackathons, and I like going and judging them as part of the Tech Transfer Office. It's also a great way to bring in partners or to bring in your local for-profit industry, for example, is you can partner with them and you can have them come in and sponsor a hackathon within an area of expertise. You can also work with groups like the Gates Foundation or other NGOs to come in and do a hackathon to help to solve an immediate problem within the social impact sphere. And finally, accountability. So a lot of times, unfortunately, we see people who take advantage of those who want to do good in their community. So you always want to be transparent and accountable for anything that you are working on. When you're working with your inventors, it can even come down to the level of ensuring that the technology actually does what they say it's going to do. A lot of times people get very excited and they say, I've got something that could make a huge difference in the world, but they don't have the proof behind it. So transparency and accountability is extremely important when you're working within the social innovation sphere, because if you are raising hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to solve a problem and you don't actually have a way to solve that problem, not only do you lose the funds and the opportunity, but you also lose credibility. You also hurt your region and you hurt the reputation of yourself, your institution. And sometimes that can really be damaging to the point where everyone around you is no longer able to be a productive and forward-thinking innovator. So please keep in mind accountability, transparency, and actually making sure that the work that you're doing or the work that your innovators are doing works. before you go out there and try and bring in those funds, those partnerships, and protect the intellectual property.
Megan, we have a question here from Jacqueline Thavorn from Thailand. Jacqueline, would you like to ask your question? It's also on the Q&A section.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So for my questions, based on my experience in Thailand, we have the social enterprise. It is the arm for running business in helping the local communities. And in Thailand, for the local communities, they have the great products. They have the unique products from their local ingredients, craftings, but they lack the knowledge in terms of the business and the commercialization. So they just sell in the local areas and they cannot expand. And the point for social enterprise is that we try to help those communities in order to expand their business, right? And one of the things that we need the investment is about to building the ecosystem or to help try to get some traffic, try to get some advantage of their product kind of things. So the point is that when we present this kind of business model in helping the local communities to the investors, and they mostly say that we should pilot something first, and in order to get the positive result, and then they can be confident in order to get some grant to us. I'm not sure whether you face with this kind of situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I strongly believe in the pilot model. So a lot of times our innovators try to do too much, and that's when they fail because they want to do it all. So absolutely starting small, identifying one primary market and going after that market, building traction, building reputation, building funding. So when it comes to working with angel investors, when it comes to working with seed funding, one of those things that we want to think about is making sure that value proposition is extremely tight. So you don't want to just say something like, I'm going to create clean water for my community. You want to say, I'm going to create a system that measures and then cleans the water in this region that has this type of lead contamination and has this level of bacteria, and I'm going to need $100,000 to complete this work within 6 months. And by defining your value proposition, defining your expectations, your goals, and your intent, it can be easier to raise the funding because your funders know exactly what they're getting for their dollars, what they're getting for their yen, what they're getting for their currency, right? So when you're thinking around doing a spin out of a company or of a technology, you want to make sure that you have a very specific, and you'll see it on the screen, the last bullet here, your business model, your value proposition is extremely clear. And the other thing you want to do is make sure that you know how to talk about that. So one of my favorite exercises, my inventors don't always agree with my favorite exercise, but my favorite exercise is to practice the art of the pitch. If you, as the invention manager, are not comfortable giving pitches, you also want to practice the art of the pitch. You never know who you're going to be talking to, and being able to put together a 30-second pitch, a 5-minute pitch, and a 10-minute pitch is extremely critical to success. So a lot of times my innovators don't have a deck on hand. And as a tech transfer manager, I don't always have the information because they didn't give it to me. So that's one thing you want to work on, is making sure that you have that portfolio, and that gives you the opportunity to be able to go out and find those funds, whether you're on a call like this, whether you're at a conference, whether you're sitting next to somebody on an airplane or traveling on a 12-hour train ride across the country. You always want to be prepared to talk about what is going on. And it's the same thing for my innovators. Before they go to a conference, I say, where's the one-pager that you're going to be sharing? What is the deck you've got ready to go? And so again, being able to articulate and clearly define the parameters of your ask, define the expectations of your technology, and being able to make sure that you're not too aspirational, that you're not dreaming, but that you really have a concrete business model, you have a concrete expectation. Those are some of the ways to find success. You also want to make sure that you are aligning with what the funder wants. So especially if you're going after funding from NGOs or other governments, is you want to make sure that you have answered exactly what they want. A lot of times I'll see a company that comes in my current job and they say, oh, I've got this fantastic new technology. Okay, well, does it work? Well, it almost works. Okay, well, what are you going to do to make it work? Well, we're still trying to figure that out, right? And so the further you probe, the more you realize that they're not actually quite there yet. And that goes back to what I mentioned earlier about being accountable, being transparent. Once you get that shot, once you get that opportunity, you really have to be ready to go. So moving up to the other bullet here is the stage of development. A lot of times our innovators come to us very, very early stage. And when they come very, very early stage, it's just not ready to go out. And that's where you really need to find those early stage partners, those grants, and what is that proof of concept? So you mentioned that in your country, you all have some opportunities to help to bring to market those social innovations, and that one of the things that your communities are looking for is the market access and the business knowledge. And that's part of that stage of development. So it's not just a technological stage of development, it's also an educational stage of development. So you might have a fantastic technology, and I'll give you an example. We had a chemical engineer who created a new type of glue for sticky notes. So if you've ever used a sticky note, a Post-it note, and it leaves behind a little bit of residue, and that can be really annoying if you're putting it on something like an electronic device. So he created a new glue that didn't leave any residue behind. The stage of technology was quite well advanced. We could have put it in the market within 6 months. But the business proposition was so poor that when we asked him for a sample of it, because we had found a potential partner, he refused to give it to us. He said, why would I want to do that? I can do it myself. This is my lab. This is my research. I can do it. So even though his technology was highly developed, his business acumen was not. And so you want to make sure you combine all of these facets together. And we mentioned a little bit earlier the value of that education. So we heard from some of the other participants here that they do educational seminars, that they go out into their classrooms, and then they talk about these kinds of things. And that can be an extremely important component here as well, is that you have to provide that business knowledge to help your innovators to think from a mindset, not just from what I can do in the lab, but how does that impact in the business communities. And then when we talk about market access, I don't know if you've had a chance to ever see something like a lean business model canvas, but that's one way to look at what is the market. So we want to be able to map out who are our key partners, what is our competition, what are the funding sources, what is the upstream and downstream engagers that we're working with, who are our stakeholders, have we done customer discovery? And so these are some of the things that you really have to work with your innovators early on to put together in order to have a successful product. Does that somewhat answer your question?
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right. Some of the other things we want to talk about as part of that market review are also knowing what the competition is doing. A lot of times our innovators will come to us and they say, I have a solution that will fix everything. I know something better than everyone else. My technology is going to be the greatest thing ever. The problem, though, is they haven't done the market review. They haven't done that competitive analysis. And oftentimes, the first question that I ask is, well, if you created something that is so much better than everyone else, why is nobody clamoring for it, right? We've got something out there. We have a one-pager. We've shopped it around at the conferences. Nobody wants what you've got. Why is that if what you have is so great? What does your market look like? How are other people solving the problem? And oftentimes, people are so focused on one direct path. They want to be the next it technology, but they don't think about the end goal. So it doesn't matter if you go this way, if other people are coming this way to solve the same problem, because the end goal is what the consumer cares about. They don't care about how they got there necessarily. They care about whether or not they did get to the same endpoint. Did their solution? So when you talk about market review, it's not just direct competitors to your technology. It's also how else are people solving this problem. We often talk about faster, cheaper, or easier, but a lot of times that doesn't necessarily matter either. We had a company that was creating a new copper material. And as part of one of their educational sessions, they had to go out and they had to talk to the businesses that would, in theory, be interested in their material. And they found out that even though the current product on the market is more expensive, it doesn't work quite as well. The companies still weren't willing to switch because the cost to change all their manufacturing for just a few pennies of difference wasn't worth it to them. So you really want to know your market review. And when it comes to social innovation, it's even more critically important because that competitive edge on a social innovation doesn't exist the same way. So you really have to have a very clear review of the market. You have to understand the upstream, the downstream, the competitors, the stakeholders. You have to develop that value proposition. You also want to talk about protection of innovation. And when we talk about protecting something, oftentimes in the social innovation space, it's not necessarily a patentable something. Maybe it's a process. Maybe it's a mechanism. Maybe it is patentable, but it's not going to be worth filing that patent because you're not going to be able to enforce the patent. So I mentioned earlier with the ColleGlow company, and Dr. Marion was partnering with people in Kenya. And in Kenya, it's not necessarily worth filing a patent on something because it's going to be more difficult to enforce that patent than it will be to pay the cost of the patent. So instead of filing a patent, we looked at using trademarks, copyrights, and agreements, memorandum of understanding, data use agreements, material transfer agreements, in order to build up an opportunity for Dr. Marion and his colleagues to create a bit of a hole in the market that they could then fill, and then that would depend on their reputation. So being first to market sometimes can be another way to bring your social innovations forward, even when you can't necessarily protect them. I see a question here. Granting a patent in Thailand takes a very long time, sometimes 3 to 5 years. How can we handle this when we need to get to market quickly? Can we do technology licensing while the patent is still in the evaluation process? So this is common worldwide. This is not unique to Thailand. It takes a long time to get a patent in most places around the world. And this is why we take advantage of the provisional patent system. This is why we take advantage of the international patents, right? So you can file a PCT, a Patent Cooperation Treaty, and that is a provisional application that gives you worldwide rights for 18 months. So during the time, once you have filed your patent, most countries around the world are a first to file country, meaning that once you have filed, you have claimed predicate status until the patent is reviewed and approved or denied. And therefore, once you have that filing, you can and should be going out and trying to find those partners, trying to find those opportunities, connections, and working with your inventors as well to make sure that over that 3 to 5 year period, they haven't substantially improved the invention to the point that you need to file yet another patent. It also is a point of sometimes you might not want to do a patent alone, or sometimes you might not want to do a patent at all. So in the case of a software invention or an algorithm or a method, you might not want to file a patent because the technology changes so quickly that by the time you get a patent on your algorithm, nobody cares anymore because that was 3 to 5 years ago. So there are other ways to protect the intellectual property in addition to patents, like I mentioned, and those are some of the things you want to think about. Does it make sense? You don't want to patent everything just to say you have a patent on something. When it comes to that protection of the invention, you want to do what's going to make the most sense within the market, what's going to make the most sense for your budget. You also aren't going to ever be able to afford to patent something everywhere in the world. Someone like Apple spends more than 250,000 US dollars on a single patent every year trying to protect it. It is not a cheap endeavor, and it is not something anyone can truly afford, even the big universities. I have colleagues who are at Stanford, I have colleagues that are at MIT. They don't file in every country around the world, even on some of the most prolific technologies. So we rely on other methods to protect it. We also want to keep perhaps some information back. So trade secrets are a viable form of intellectual property protection. They can be challenging in an academic environment because oftentimes faculty want to publish, they want to share what they're working on. But you can certainly use it as a method to protect what you're doing in the development stage. I've also used design patents before, which are easier and cheaper to get. I've used the opportunities of copyright on software rather than going for a patent on the algorithm. When it comes to understanding your competitive landscape, that can also be key from an intellectual property perspective. Before you file a patent, you should absolutely search WIPO's database and you should search your own database. What else is already out there? Have you assessed the white space for patentability? And then finally, when it comes to invention analysis, all of these come together. When you do an inventive analysis, you should be able to walk through every single one of these steps and answer them with something that makes sense. You don't want to go out into the world with your invention if you're not confident and comfortable that this invention is going to actually be something that is useful and makes a difference to your community. If you do this inventive analysis and you find that the technology is not novel enough to patent, doesn't have enough of a market share to make it worthwhile, a stage of development is too early, and the business model is not there, that doesn't mean that you just walk away. It means that you tell your inventors, this is where you can patent, this is where you can publish instead of patent. This is where you can talk about your work. This is where you can draw interest and funding so that then maybe the next round you can do more. So it's still an opportunity, even if there's not a protectable opportunity. Even if there's not a business opportunity, use it as a goodwill opportunity. Especially when it comes to social innovation. Maybe you just want to release it into the community because you want to help your community to improve. Maybe you want to create something like an OpenAI. Maybe you want to create something that gives the community access to the resources so that they can have more funds available to send people to your university. Several of the universities that I work with in Kentucky are losing students because their communities are too poor to be able to afford to send the students there. So maybe you release a technology that helps the community to grow economically for free because in exchange you bring people back. Maybe it's something that helps to build the reputation of your institution. So one of the things that I worked on was SOPs, standard operating procedures for medical practice. So this would help someone to understand how to treat someone with hypothermia, for example. And we released these into the community with an end user license agreement and no cost. And the reason we did that was because then the community started using these tools that we had developed at the institution. And then they would send their patients to our institution for care because they knew that we would do a good job. And the cost of bringing in these patients to our medical campus at the university and the amount of revenue that was made by the institution for that was worth way more than what we would have gotten if we tried to charge a licensing fee on those same documents. And so again, when it comes to social innovation, one of the capitals that you have the opportunity to build is your reputation. And that can be incredibly valuable as well. It's not just always going to be about bringing in the money. It can also be about building the reputation, building the education for your students, and establishing a place within the community that will help you to, down the line, bring in more partners, more connections, more collaboration. So management of social innovations can also be a bit more challenging. We've talked a little bit about some of the funding opportunities here, and we've had some of the people on the call speak up. But when it comes to funding for social innovation, you don't necessarily have the same pathways. Especially when it comes to venture capital funding, oftentimes they're looking for that next unicorn. They're looking for that next really exciting, hot topic technology. And so you might need to start earlier. Corporate philanthropies are one way to go. A lot of companies have set up a philanthropic arm. And within your community, if they haven't set that up, it's worth asking them. It's worth going and talking to a company to try and get a partnership in place. Philanthropic engagement is something that we've talked quite a bit about. And so we do have a question in the chat around funding for the 17 SDG goals. So some of those things include the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or the Gates Foundation now. Some of those include things like Unite for Sight that I mentioned earlier. So there are going to be opportunities for funding that are available internationally through philanthropic engagement, but you are going to have to look for them. There's not one website that magically lists all of the potential funding opportunities. So when you start searching for these kinds of things, you're going to want to look for philanthropic engagement. You're going to want to look for keywords like foundations, and that's going to help you to find a little bit more about what funding is available addressing those goals. You can also go through the United Nations website, and they often have a list of opportunities for competitions or for funding partnerships. And I'm going to pause here because we have another question around intellectual property from a university. And I will answer a little bit about it from my institution, but then I'm going to ask you all to also give some of your own experiences. So our question is intellectual property from a university. Who is the owner of the patent? Is it the university? When the professors or students start a company, when they license with specific conditions, what is the case in your country? Is it an exclusive license? Is it something that they even have to license? So this is certainly something that can vary country by country, but it can also vary institution by institution. In most of my institutions, we set up an intellectual property policy. And that intellectual property policy governs the way that we will handle intellectual property transfer, whether it be for students, for staff, for professors, for visiting faculty. That sets up the tone of the ownership of the patent. In my particular case, when I started at Kentucky, they didn't all have an intellectual property policy. And so we had to help them to develop that. If your institution does not have one of those explicitly called out and updated every 4 to 6 years, then this is an area for you to be able to help provide support to the institution. The other thing that you want to think about here when it comes to intellectual property policies is the differences between copyright material, patentable material, and trademarking material, especially. You'll also want to think about whether you can keep a trade secret at the institution and what are the parameters that you'll set around that. And finally, especially in this world where we've been doing more and more with data, with AI, with machine learning, I strongly recommend that any policy that you have today talks about data use, talks about material transfer, talks about biologicals. So again, you're not going to patent something like a biological because it's found in nature, and you cannot patent something that is found in nature. But you might have a material transfer agreement around that. You're not going to patent data because raw data is not patentable, but you might have a data use agreement around that. So I'm going to drop the question open to the rest of you. Does anyone want to talk about an intellectual property policy that you have at your institution, or do you not have one but you would like to learn about developing one? Arun?
Yes, we don't have one actually in our university. But the age of our innovation hub is also very new, just 1.5 years ago, where I'm involved with. And I find, and I never thought of actually developing intellectual property policy for my institute. But now, listening to you, I find that yes, we should do it because we have a lot of innovations going on. And definitely the reason why actually, when I was reading your circular for applying for this fellowship to attend, the Asia-Pacific region being one of the very poor patenting and filing for intellectual property. This is true. This is true for my university also. We have a lot of innovations, but we file very few, and the country policy for patenting is very complex and lengthy, sometimes tiring. So it's better to have something for the university that could encourage our faculties and students. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly when it comes to patenting, it's a country by country basis. So when you file a patent, ultimately you only get a patent granted in the countries that you pay for. And oftentimes I've seen people who are outside of the US, outside of Europe, outside of Japan, or outside of places like Australia who won't file in their own country, but they will file in one of these market countries. So they are not necessarily paying to file in the country that they are inventing in because they, like in the case of Kenya, they may not be able to enforce that. But that doesn't mean that they shouldn't have an IP policy. An intellectual property policy is something that governs who owns the intellectual property generated. What are the responsibilities that they have to disclose that technology? What are the responsibilities of the technology managers in being timely and responsive? What are the expectations around the revenue that has been generated, if there is any, and how will that be dispersed out? So intellectual property is still property, and oftentimes people forget about that. Just like you buy your house and you have the property rights to your home, when you have a patent, you have the property right to that patent. It's something that can be passed down in a will. It is something that is something you can sell or trade. We call them licensing agreements when you give the right to that intellectual property. So a patent or a copyright or a trademark or a data use agreement, all of these kinds of things are extremely important to have clearly articulated and clearly enumerated within a policy in your university, the same as you would have a policy for anything else. Priscilla.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. I just have a few questions that I wanted to ask. So I'm coming from the business perspective. So say, for example, we have imagine software companies that have developed technologies, they have developed software. So they've written the algorithm to do certain things. And these products are already commercialized and are selling at subscription cloud-based level to different customers in the marketplace. Now, there's a potential for exporting the product to the region. So say, for example, another Pacific Island country wants to utilize the software. For us in PNG, we do not have a patents office. Most of our IP is mostly foreign patents. Almost 70% of it is foreign IP. But we have local domestic innovations that have been developed, which potential for export. My question is, we don't have resources like IP lawyers to work with commercial businesses to look at the export revenue, especially when they're selling these products. What would be like a standard framework for emerging markets like ourselves to enable those discussions around products that have export potential, whether it's licensing agreement, what sort of frameworks would really govern that process? Because there's really nothing in place, and big companies are coming and saying we want to acquire your product, so they're already looking at acquisitions, but there really isn't any benefit development for the innovator themselves. So just a general question around that.
Yeah, and I suspect that you'll learn a bit more about that at this summit. So I would encourage you to continue to ask that question along the way. But I would say you don't necessarily need to have a lawyer to develop the license agreements. So that is the job of a tech transfer professional, is to do those license agreements directly. And you have, I believe, Bilal, correct me if not, but I believe you all have access to the AUTM community. And that's going to be a great way to go and ask some of these questions about how do you set up a license agreement. There are some standard agreements that are available. You also want to make sure that you have that policy in place. Because if you don't have that policy in place and you do bring in that revenue, there can be a lot of challenges around who gets to benefit from that. So if you have I wouldn't necessarily recommend an acquisition if you have multiple companies coming after you. So you can do a non-exclusive license agreement, meaning that more than one company can get access to that technology for a limited period of time in a limited manner, so that you are able to bring in more opportunity than if you simply did an exclusive license to someone else. Typically, universities also license, we don't sell. And the rationale for that is that we retain those rights ourselves rather than giving them up. So I would recommend that you continue to use that AUTM digital membership to ask questions within that space, to develop out those processes. You can also work with WIPO. WIPO does have some lawyers available who can help to provide some insights when it comes to that intellectual property protection as well. And if there's more time, we can certainly circle back again, but I think this is something that you're going to be continuing to hear throughout the IP Summit, and it's something that you're going to continue to hear over your time in the program.
Yeah, and for everyone's information, you will all get an AUTM digital membership account. This will be for 1 year, and it will be given to you soon as soon as we collect all the information. Okay, Quang Nguyen has raised his hand.
Yes, thank you very much for sharing your information. I just quickly want to let you know a little bit about the intellectual assets management activities in Saigon. Currently, our community have 657 members. We have trained our members since 2008. We already promulgate the IP policy and IAM policy, intellectual assets management, in 162 organizations, including universities, SMEs. The purpose is that we want to have the organizations to have their own staffs with the knowledge, deep knowledge and skills in intellectual assets management. It is bigger than IP itself, because IP normally focus focuses on IP protection and prosecution, but I make more than that. It means we use the IP law as the core, but then people try to assetize their intellectual assets in advance, and the IPR is just the later on is the result of it, like the exclusive rights. So we have different positions in intellectual assets management, in their own organization, so that they know how to reduce the risks for their assets, the property risks first, and then later on, if their assets, their intellectual products are useful in the society, then we will register, we will follow the IP procedures in order to establish IP rights later. All right. So that's why our community is quite big so far, and we have some, IP and IAM policies in more than 160 organizations so far, and we each member will need to, for example, they need to learn 5 different modules in order to be an assistant at the beginning. After that, they will become the IP manager, IAM managers, and later on, IAM directors. So in total, if they want to be like the director in terms of intellectual assets management, they need to finish 450, 50 hours. And some organization already, they, for example, some organization, they already established the IPRs in different countries, and they, try to commercialize internationally. So that is some stories, and maybe later on when we meet in person in Vietnam, I may share, some story and learn from you, and also share our own stories. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And certainly providing that education and training is wonderful to do. It also provides a commonality point. So a lot of times one of the challenges is if you have collaborators who are working at other institutions and they don't have the same policy, that can become a bit more of a challenge for a licensee who is interested in partnering with you. So being able to have these similar policies across all the institutions can make you a more valuable potential partner. All right.
Okay, we have a few minutes to go. So any other question? We gave everyone a copy of your slides, so you can see all your slides.
Wonderful. Yes. And I just want to conclude by saying these opportunities are all over the world. Every one of you has the opportunity to be a social innovator. Every one of you has the opportunity to launch a social innovation. So in the slides, you'll see examples from Malaysia, from Vietnam, from Indonesia, right? There's doesn't matter that you're not coming from a established company or an established country or an established institution. The goal of social innovation is to create a better world for all of us, and we all have the opportunity to play our part. So again, thank you all for your time today and for bringing your thoughts, your questions, your engagements. And I think that the best thing that you can do for yourselves is to educate, to take advantage of the resources that you have access to ask the questions, and to create those partnerships, those networks, and realize that we're all in this together. As a collective, technology transfer is not a field that is large. We are all here, we are all partnering together, so please do realize that you can reach out, you can find those connections, those collaborations, learn from each other, open up the doors, and have the conversation so that we can all get to a point where we are professionals who are able to engage, support, and transform our world.
That's great. Thank you very much, Megan.